ethnic category and you're saying wealth category, or you're saying dominant or minority category. And lastly, common identity. Dominant members identify with one another because of their shared physical or cultural traits. Minority groups. Let me go back over that. Minority groups share 5 characteristics. Ascribed status, so membership comes through birth. So what I should have said is being born poor. I got that mixed up. Prejudice. The dominant group holds the minority's physical or cultural traits in low esteem. They're better. Discrimination. The dominant group treats members of the minority group unequally. Endogamy. Dominant members tend to marry within their group, as do minority groups. And lastly, a common identity. Minority groups identify with one another because of their shared physical or cultural traits and the disadvantages that come with those. Now, when it comes to minority groups and their goals, they have 4 different objectives. Number 1, assimilation. They're wanting to be treated as individuals, not as members of a separate group. Members of the minority group adopt the culture of the dominant group are also absorbed in the larger society. What does that mean? Basically, they want to fit in. They don't want to be different, they just want to be seen as everybody else, right? Secondly, pluralism. The minority group wants to live peacefully with the dominant group, yet maintain the differences that set it apart and are important to their identity. So when you hear the word pluralism, another word for pluralism is like multiculturalism. So basically, we want to exist in your group, but we still want to be free to be who we are at the same time.
Is it kind of like socialist? Or not really?
In a way.
Yeah.
In a way, yeah, I would say. Number 3, secession. Wanting cultural and political independence, the minority seeks to separate itself and form a separate nation. Now, when we say a separate nation, not literally, but basically they're saying, we want our own freedom and our own independence too. We don't want to be held to your rules and what you expect is the norm. Lastly, militancy. Convinced of its own superiority, the minority wants to reverse the status and dominate the society. So those are the four goals of minorities according to our textbook. And that doesn't mean that each individual has that goal, that's just minorities as a whole, that they're generalizing. Now let's get to policies of the dominant groups. The goals and policies of minority groups differ greatly from those of dominant groups. The policies of dominant groups range from acceptance to rejection. So number 1, pluralism, aka multiculturalism, exists when a dominant group permits or even encourages cultural differences. Assimilation, an attempt to eliminate the minority by absorbing it into the mainstream culture, right, fitting in. Enforced assimilation, the dominant group bans the minority's religion, language, and other distinctive customs. This is what happened with the Native Americans back when colonialism happened and all of that. We'll be talking more about that later today. Permissible assimilation lets the minority adopt the dominant customs at its own pace. I kind of don't like that sentence because it indicates that you need permission from the other group and you don't. But. Segregation, an attempt by the dominant group to keep a minority in its place, off by itself, and to keep them exploitable. Internal colonialism. Colonialism refers to a more powerful nation making a colony of a weaker nation so it can exploit its resources. Sound familiar? Kind of what happened with the United States. Internal colonialism refers to events within the same country where a dominant group exploits a minority group's labor. Population transfer. In direct population transfer, the dominant group transfers the minority to a specified area or forces it to leave its country. In other words, deportation, or even in more extreme circumstances, when we send people away to concentration camps. We will learn about that in our assignment about the Japanese Americans and what happened with Pearl Harbor. Indirect population transfer occurs when the dominant group makes life so miserable for a minority that its members choose to leave. Lastly, we have genocide, which is the most extreme, indirect population transfer. And this occurs when the dominant group makes life, no, it's little. This occurs when the dominant group, there's no nice way to say this, but essentially kills a group of people. That's genocide. So, like what happened to the Jews in the time of Hitler. Okay, so speaking of Hitler, we're going to talk about ideals of racial superiority. So I wish I could say that this is no longer a thing, but still alive and well in the world. So we'll talk about what's happened in history. Adolf Hitler was a leader of the Nazi Party in Germany during the 1900s. He had ideas around racial supremacy. Hitler was convinced that race, the inherited physical characteristics that identify a group of people, made some people superior and others inferior. In his mind, tall, fair-skinned, mostly blonde-haired people called the Aryans formed a super race. A related development of the time was eugenics. Has anybody heard of eugenics? So eugenics is basically the attempt to improve humans through selective breeding. So I kind of think of dog breeders, how they want to keep the dogs pure, right? And they keep breeding the animals so that they'll have the pure bloods. As horrible it is to compare humans to dogs, that is essentially what the idea of eugenics is. If we keep mating, this super race, right, of people, we'll eventually have a race of all perfect people. Eugenics was such a popular idea and a dominant idea that it was approved by scientists, educators, health specialists, religious leaders, and prominent politicians of the Western nations, including the United States. So everybody was on board with this idea. The idea of racial superiority, which justifies one group's rule over another, is certainly less popular today, but the ideology still persists. Almost everyone assumes race really exists, identifies with some racial group, and classifies other people into different racial groups. Some think that their race are superior to others. Now let's talk about immigrants in the melting pot. Immigrants have confronted Anglo-conformity throughout history, and by Anglo we mean European. They were expected to speak English and adopt other Anglo-Saxon ways of life. Many thought that the evolving society would become a melting pot, right? We've heard that term when we talk about America. That it would melt European immigrants into a new cultural and biological blend. However, we know some people were not invited to join the melting pot. Americans of Western European background set up walls to prevent non-whites from becoming part of this new biological mix. To protect themselves from what they called racial impurity, they passed laws that put blacks and whites in separate schools and made it illegal for blacks and whites to marry. So we know about that through segregation. And the important thing about segregation is it also affected other people of color too. Each group of immigrants that entered the U.S. confronted prejudice based on stereotypes. Stereotypes are generalizations of what people are like. So stereotypes and prejudice are very similar, almost interchangeable. Both individual and institutional discrimination occur, with individuals being based on one person treating another badly based on their race or ethnicity, and institutional referring to inequality built into a social system, right, like the criminal justice system or something like that. When institutional racism occurs, not only does the dominant group take institutional racism for granted, but often it also assumes that this is the way life should be. Although greatly weakened, institutional discrimination continues where people conform. Now let's talk about some sociological theories. So what would symbolic interactionists say? Symbolic deconstructionists examine how labels, like terms, classifications, symbols, or stereotypes, affect how we look at life and how we act. We know words are not meaningless. The labels we learn both color the way we see the world and they influence our behavior. No one is born prejudiced or stereotyping or wanting to discriminate. We're not born with even a single value or belief. Each of us is born into a particular family and racial ethnic group. There we learn values, beliefs, and ways to perceive the world. There we also learn how to label members of other groups. We might learn prejudice and discrimination as a routine part of everyday life. Or we might learn that prejudice and discrimination are wrong. Or somewhere in the middle, right? As we grow up, we learn stereotypes, ways of classifying entire groups of people, men, women, the elderly, racial ethnic groups, people with disabilities, even people who are good at computers, everything like that. Learning to classify people, to place them in boxes, is a normal and inevitable part of socialization. It is one way that we learn the ways of our society. These labels or stereotypes become lenses through which we view people. Many racial ethnic labels are loaded with negative emotions, such as the N-word. The emotional impact of such words overpower us, creating selective perception. That is, these labels lead us to see certain things while blinding us for others. For example, if our stereotype of a group of people is negative, we tend to block positive information about that group. So if we already think negative, we kind of just lean that way. Negative terms and stereotypes then are dangerous. They create selective perception, they justify discrimination, and in extreme instances, even facilitate mass murder, like in the case of Hitler. Now let's look at functionalism. Functionalists argue that the benefits of a social pattern or some characteristic of society must be greater than the cost, or else that pattern will disappear. The benefits or functions of discrimination, then, must outweigh its costs or dysfunction. So, the discrimination woven into U.S. history benefited the dominant group, right? Somebody benefits of it. By killing Native Americans or transferring them to reservations, whites gained free farmland, forests, lakes, and gold. They also benefited from owning slaves, acquiring cheap labor, and selling the slaves' labor as masons, carpenters, or factory workers. Slave labor allowed many owners to live a charmed life. Racial ethnic stratification, or the unequal distribution of a society's resources based on race or ethnicity, essentially helps get society's dirty work done. When a racial ethnic group climbs the social class ladder, it leaves the dirty work behind. Because the dirty work still has to be done, other groups take over the tasks. For example, some African Americans have moved into the middle class, and undocumented immigrants are doing much of the work they used to do. Those who have entered the United States illegally have little control over their working conditions. They take jobs that practically no one else will do, often working long hours in crowded, dirty, and even dangerous conditions. And they work cheaply, for some employers pay under the table, skipping the costs of unemployment compensation, Social Security, medical, overtime, or vacation pay. Now let's look at the conflict theory. According to the conflict theory, the dominant group pits racial ethnic groups against one another in order to exploit workers and increase profit, right? Let's distract from the owners and make them mad at one another. The United States has a capitalist economy. Our economic system is based on investing capital with the goal of making a profit, right? Money literally makes our world go round. So profit is the result of selling items for more than they cost to produce. In conflict theory, this is called extracting the surplus value of labor, right? So it's making $1 out of 50 cents, basically. For example, if each item that a factory produces costs the owners $1 for materials, $1 for rent, $1 for advertising, and $1 for a worker to run the machine, then the total cost is $4. If the owners sell the item for $5, they make a $1 profit. Conflict theorists claim that the profit represents a surplus value resulting from the labor used to produce the item. That is, the item increased in value because the worker added his or her labor to the item. The split labor market, lower wages, increases profit. To keep wages low, capitalists use a split labor market. By splitting workers along racial ethnic lines, they weaken their bargaining power. It is difficult for workers who fear and distrust one another to unite and demand higher wages and more benefits. To maintain a split labor market, the unemployed are also a valuable tool. If everyone who wants to work has a job, then workers can threaten to quit unless they receive higher pay and better working conditions. But workers without jobs provide a pool of needy workers that owners can dip into when they need to expand production or to break a strike, right? If you guys aren't gonna work, there's somebody out there that doesn't have a job that'll work, right? So it makes it a little bit harder. When the economy contracts or when the strike is settled, these workers, called a reserve labor force, can be laid off to rejoin the unemployed with no unsettling effects on society. So owners pretty much have a pool of workers no matter who they are. Minority workers are ideal for the reserve labor force, as the dominant group of white workers seldom objects to what happens to unemployed members of minority groups. Splitting labor among racial ethnic lines encourages minorities and whites to view one another as enemies, able to make gains only at the expense of the other. So conflict theory is really heavy on that. Riots and other violence that result from racial ethnic divisions threaten the power elite, who often try to diffuse the situation by offering concessions. Right? You guys are mad, pissed off about your pay, here's a pizza party, right? You see that whole up. They give a little here and there, whatever seems necessary to quiet the restless, threatening low-paid workers and the unemployed. This might increase welfare benefits, allow token representation on committees, or offer government aid to reconstruct inner cities. These acts are not coming from generous hearts intended to improve the lives of the disadvantaged. Rather, their purpose is to diffuse the situation and protect the privileged positions of the powerful. So those are all three different perspectives on race and ethnicity. Let's look at research findings. Starting with Latinos. Latino is an umbrella term that the dominant group has developed to lump people who are from different cultural backgrounds in a single category. So what do people all have in common? They trace their origins to the Spanish-speaking countries of North and South America. That's it, nothing more. So everybody who's considered a Latino comes from a Spanish-speaking country. These are people of diverse cultures who are swept together in a single term, and they now form the largest ethnic group in the United States. Most Latinos are U.S. citizens, but about 9 million have entered the country illegally. This massive unauthorized entry into the United States has been at the center of a national debate. One reaction has been to give work permits and offer paths to citizenship. But the main reaction has been to try to stop the illegal entry. There has been such a vast migration from Spanish-speaking countries that many millions more Latinos live in the United States than Canadians live in Canada, just to give us an idea. Although not all Latinos speak Spanish, most do. The United States has no official language, and the growing use of Spanish provoked an English-only movement that has the goal of passing a constitutional amendment that declares English the official language of the United States. Although that movement has weakened, 32 states have passed laws that declare English the official language of their states. Latinos fare poorly on indicators of economic well-being. They earn less, are more poor, and complete high school at lower rates. Major divisions exist in the Latino community, with some rejecting assimilation in favor of emphasizing and maintaining Latino culture, while others stress the need for fast and thorough assimilation. Latinos hold only a fraction of elected positions, with several Latinos being elected on state and federal levels. Divisions based on country of origin hold back the potential political power of Latinos. These distinctions nourish disunity and create political discord. So for example, people from Puerto Rico might feel little sense of unity with people from Mexico. So even within the umbrella term, there's some division. Okay, African Americans. Historically, African Americans have been set apart by society as separate and unequal, figuratively and literally, by segregation laws separating whites from non-whites in schools, buses, and overall society. To break institutional barriers that supported American apartheid, Martin Luther King Jr., among others, led African Americans in civil disobedience, deliberately but peacefully disobeying laws considered unjust. Change was resisted, and residents participated in urban revolts to push for change. After King's death, Black militants rushed in to fill the void in leadership. Like King, they emphasized Black unity and Black pride, but unlike King, some of them proclaimed that violence was the way to gain equality. In 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, making it illegal to discriminate in hotels, theaters, and other public places. Then, in 1965, the Voting Rights Act banned the literacy test that whites had used to keep African Americans from voting. Change has been gradual, but over time the change has been profound. Today's race relations are vastly different from those of 60 years ago. African Americans have made remarkable gains in politics, education, and jobs. African Americans are represented in politics at higher rates than Latinos, but less than whites. They fare better in all aspects of economic well-being than in the past, but obviously there is still much room to grow. The African American middle class has expanded. Income has risen since the past, but discrimination continues to influence earning power. Next, let's talk about Asian Americans. So Asian is an umbrella term that the dominant group has used to lump people who are from different cultural backgrounds into a single category. They trace their origins to the various countries of China, India, the Philippines, Vietnam, Korea, Japan, among others. Asian Americans, like other minorities, have a long history of discrimination. In the 1800s, the U.S. promoted an intercontinental railroad to unite the East and West coasts. Short on labor, those building the railroad turned to China, which brought about 200,000 Chinese workers to the United States. Although 90% of the workers for the railroad were Chinese, white workers prevented the Chinese from being in the photo of this historic event. After the railroad was finished, many Chinese settled in the West. To intimidate their new competition, white workers formed mobs and vigilante groups. Many anti-Asian laws ensued, denying Asians from immigration or obtaining citizenship. In 1941, U.S. Naval Station Pearl Harbor was bombed by Japan, leading to detention of innocent Japanese Americans for looking like the enemy. Asians tend to fare better than all other minority groups, financially, educationally, and economically. High income is tied to family life, educational achievement, and assimilation into mainstream culture. They are the most likely group to grow up with two parents. There is high rates of intermarriage among Asians. Success in school leads to more economic stability. And we also have Native Americans. Native American is yet another umbrella term that refers to indigenous individuals who occupied what is now North America, and it covers different tribes with various languages and various cultures, and again, it lumps them all into one term. The history of Native Americans is horrific and sad. European colonization and later expansion turned deadly as the Native Americans stood in the way. Upon European colonization of the Americas, Native Americans died in staggering numbers due to genocide, through violence, invasion, diseases, and inhumane treatment. Treaties between the colonizers and natives were signed, guaranteeing rights to lands, but then they were broken, leading to rebellion and resistance. Colonizers pushed natives to assimilate through education, sending native children to boarding schools, which we'll talk more about this in a little bit as well. Overall, Native Americans have lower rates of income and wealth, and they're more likely to use substances and commit suicide. This group is sometimes called the invisible minority. Now let's talk about social policy. A unified society certainly is desirable, especially in contrast to a broken, fragmented one with hostile groups working across currents. Social policy centers on the twin goals of encouraging cultural pluralism and preventing discrimination. To reach cultural pluralism, we must practice cultural integrity, so accepting and appreciating diverse backgrounds by establishing cultural centers that feature groups' heritages, hold ethnic appreciation days in public schools, teach history in ways that recognize contributions of all the groups that make up the U.S., and teach foreign languages starting in grade school. The emphasis of cultural pluralism on pride in one's own racial ethnic heritage does not mean to retreat into a racial ethnic culture. Although children of minority groups should be encouraged to take pride in their rich heritage, if they're also to participate in mainstream culture, then the children of the dominant group, too, need to be proficient in English and other basic skills. The school system is uniquely equipped to teach these skills. Anyone who does not learn to speak English, or who speaks it poorly, or who fails to get a good education is at a severe disadvantage in competing for positions that pay well and offer advancement. Social policy would be incomplete if we did not try to prevent discrimination, and for this, the legal system is a powerful tool. It can be used to ensure that minorities are not discriminated against in jobs, housing, education, or other areas of social life. Lastly, let's talk about the future of the problem. The future of race and ethnic relations is unknown, but it is likely that progress will continue to be made. Most Americans reject the discriminatory practices of the past. Progress has been slow but steady over the years for minority groups, with events like World War II and the Civil Rights Movement dispelling segregation. However, gaps remain, and race and ethnic relations continue to struggle. And that is it for our little snippet into race and ethnic relations. Does anybody have any questions?